Hey folks, what's up? It's your boy El Maalim. I'm just coming at you with a quick video right now. I'm working on a bigger video about borders, which hopefully will come out soon, but I had top surgery. Dun, 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 dun. I'm still recovering from that. Under my classy shirt, I'm actually still all padded and strapped up. That's also why my hair is a hot mess. I haven't had a shower in about a week. Yay. But I just wanted to come at you with a video on the topic of identity politics. I think it's a really interesting topic. I think that it's one that people have a lot of different takes on, and all of them are bad. I think that there's an interesting opportunity here for us to do some Marxist analysis. This video is not quite as elaborate as my usual stuff. It's just me speaking off the cuff, so I figured it would go well with a sketchbook flip through. So let's. Hey folks, welcome. This is my 2021 sketchbook. I actually filled this one so fast, it was literally just from March till August of last year. It was a personal record. The stickers on the front, by the way, were designed by my partner, Jay Havens, and by Vert Partout, or Petit Beto Vert. As I flip through the sketchbook, you'll notice there's a lot of text in there. I believe Matthew asked on a previous video, what is all of the text? A lot of them are poems, and some of them are journal entries. For the poems, some of them are published, so I'll put a link below where you can check out some of my published poetry, and you might find some of these pieces in there. But let's get into our little brass tacks. So today, I wanted to talk about the concept of identity politics, and specifically, see if we can do some dialectical thinking about identity politics, specifically thinking about the concepts of liberal identity politics versus quote-unquote class reductionism versus radical identity politics. So the origins of identity politics, from my research, were actually pretty radical to start with. So they come out of the civil rights movement and other movements like that, such as AIM, the American Indian movement. And so these movements actually were really materialist, and they were pretty based because they were, about actually saying like these identities affect people's material conditions. This is why like indigenous people are dispossessed. This is why Black people are impoverished, etc., etc. It kind of goes to like, if you think about some of like Martin Luther King's quotes, we think of him now as being quite liberal, but actually he had a lot of radical things to say, especially later on in life, he became very socialist. The problem is, of course, that these movements became recuperated by capitalism, as a lot of movements do, into a form of liberal identity politics. It basically became a form of advertising. So they started to trade on the radical aesthetic of marginalized groups, such as Black people, LGBT people, indigenous people, etc., but without actually challenging the status quo of capitalism. So it just became about being, a girl boss or a Black CEO, buying back the block and these kinds of things. One of the interesting things about, liberal identity politics is it's actually kind of intrinsically racist, because it's based on sort of like a monolithic view of the groups that are tokenized and raised up. Because, if you as a Black CEO are the representative of Black people as a whole, it makes it seem like Black people are just kind of like one group that's all the same. Another characteristic of liberal identity politics is that it's often weaponized by people in power. It's a lot more sympathetic to present yourself as a victim. Even I do it. For example, I might talk about being a trans person. I might talk about being a person of color. I might even talk about some of my mental health issues, but I don't as frequently talk about the fact that I actually grew up with a great degree of financial privilege because I grew up as a child of professional immigrants. That has really changed a lot of things for my life. For example, now that I'm going through top surgery, I was able to pay for it out of pocket, even though I've been saving for many years, but I've still been able to take several months off of work recently without having to worry about it too much, because even though I have a professional degree, I don't have student loans. And the reason that people don't like to talk about that kind of stuff is because presenting yourself in a position of power is less sympathetic than saying like, woe is me, I'm struggling. And people do this no matter how powerful they are. You know, like at my previous job, the head of the organization was a trans woman of color, but she was also the leader of the organization and a person who made a 6 or 7 figure salary. And you know, like even if you're Black, trans, and a woman, you're still the CEO of the corporation, and you might still treat your employees like shit, even if many of them are white. The other thing about liberal identity politics is it leads to competitiveness about victimhood because it correlates moral validity or moral rightness with being the most oppressed. So for example, a lot of cis women have become TERFs because it doesn't feel valid enough to say, you know, whether the statement is accurate or not, I honestly don't think it is, but it doesn't feel as valid to say, you know, LGBT rights and trans rights have taken people's attention away from women's issues, which might be a true-ish statement, but instead they say, you know, trans people are victimizing us as women, they're taking over our spaces, blah, 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 because that seems more sympathetic. It makes you seem powerless. It makes you seem worthy of solidarity in a different way. And the other thing about liberal identity politics that I think really frustrates people is that it feels very theoretical because it's divorced from materialism. Like I said, you could be the CEO of a corporation, a Fortune 500 company, but because you're Black or because you're gay, you might say like, oh, I'm marginalized. And like to your minimum wage workers, it doesn't feel that way. So it feels kind of like you're just saying bullshit. And so because of that, there have kind of been 2 reactions to this. The first one, which, I think could have been the solution, but nobody ever listens to Black women, is the concept of intersectionality, which was popularized by Kimberly Crenshaw, because she's the one who coined that particular term, but basically is a kind of like multi-layered materialist analysis that shows how different marginalized identities interact with one another and kind of like layer on top of each other to create certain material conditions. But of course, intersectionality itself now has been recuperated into the liberal logic, into this sort of like point system where it's about like how many different marginalized identities can you claim. And again, people are incentivized to claim their marginalized identities, but not their privileged ones. And this takes some really, really weird formats. Like, I don't know if y'all have done the unpacking the knapsack of privilege exercise. I'm not sure if that's exactly what it's called, but basically the premise is like, you know, the facilitator reads out a list of like privileges and disadvantages, and you step forward, step back, and then everybody's supposed to like throw a piece of paper into a box, but some of the people who have more privileges are much closer to the box than the other. And I think that this is like not inherently a bad thing, but again, focusing on it as a sort of point system doesn't give room for people to talk about the differences of their situations and to do more direct material analysis. And so one reaction to this that has become increasingly popular as well is the concept of quote unquote class reductionism. So this is trying to reintroduce like pure Marxist analysis, you know, like basically saying like the only identity that matters is whether you're a proletarian or a bourgeois person. This is theoretically a good thing in that, you know, again, it starts to talk about like what is the situation, particularly in like labor, that people are actually inside of, and like what are the power dynamics that people have in terms of like labor and the market, which I think is good. But also the people who advocate this style kind of tell on themselves, because, you know, when you say like the only identity that matters is whether you're a worker or an owner, it's not that that's not right, but it's not actually a rejection of identity politics. It's just centering your own identities. And often the identity that's centered is whiteness and masculinity. This kind of goes hand in hand with how whiteness, masculinity, being Western, etc., are deemed to be, you know, neutral or rational or normative. So these kinds of identities are treated as the default. And so basically a lot of these folks, you know, They just don't care to hear basically about what women have to say or what queer people have to say or what people of color have to say. And that's not necessarily to say that none of these class reductionists are people of color. One person here on YouTube, for example, who advocates this perspective is Angie Speaks, who has made quite an extensive video about why she's a class reductionist, even though she's a Black woman. And again, I don't think that, there's anything intrinsically wrong with wanting to have a class-based analysis. But again, when you buy into this discourse that class is the only thing that matters, it kind of erases how these other identities actually play into class-based analysis. Because, the marginalized identities that we have actually do affect our abilities to function in the workplace and to gain certain privileges. First of all, if you're a disabled person, you're not even able to participate in the workplace in some respects, depending on your disability, and depending on what kind of work you're trying to do. But also, as a person of color or as a person who is an immigrant, you may also be denied workforce participation. And if we only talk about, whether you work or whether you don't, you might say that those people are part of, the lumpen proletariat, which often is not a group that's upheld by these so-called class reductionists because they valorize work. But also it doesn't explain things like wage gaps and the other ways that women, and particularly women of color, are marginalized more than people who are in similar positions to them, which also doesn't mean that, again, those people can't also gain privilege by becoming capitalists and particularly by weaponizing their identities in certain ways. I also want to say here, one of the critiques that working class white people that I've met have levied is that the people of color or the queer people that they see in media are powerful compared to them. And so they use that to invalidate identity politics as a whole. But that's taking the wrong end of the stick entirely. The only famous lesbian is Ellen DeGeneres, and she's not that marginalized, but it's literally because she's not marginalized that she's being uplifted as a paragon of the gays. The people who are less marginalized, even within marginalized groups, are the ones who end up gaining social power. And that doesn't discredit the whole marginalized group. It just shows that capitalism is willing to find any distinction of privilege and uplift that. So this is the place in my notes where I just wrote the word synthesis in all caps. But basically what I wanted to say here is class is important, but so is identity, because they're interrelated to each other and they elucidate things about each other. If you are white, even if you're a working class person, you may still have certain levels of privilege that you might not realize. For example, you might come from a family that owned the house they live in, which is something that most people of color don't experience. Or you might have certain kinds of generational wealth that you're going to inherit that people of color don't experience. Or even simpler things like you might be more likely to get a job than a brown person, or as a cis person, you might be more likely to get a job than a trans person, which affects your ability to participate in the market. I think I said participate. To participate in the market in a way that you might not realize. And it's not to say that identity politics is the only thing that matters or class is the only thing that matters, but that you have to have a dynamic understanding of how these things all feed into each other. Because, even if you're powerful as a person of color or as a trans person, that might feel more precarious to you, or you might actually be more precarious in that position than someone who has a larger social safety net because of their identities. But at the same time, you can truly be a, white cis person who is very marginalized because you're unhoused or because you are very poor and you live in a community where there's no opportunity for mobility. And those are also identity-based analyses. I think that, again, this centering of whiteness makes it seem like not having an identity is being white. And if you have an identity, that means that you're brown or queer or a woman or whatever. But it's we all have identities, and all of our identities play into how we move through the world and how other people respond to us. And I think that basically what I have to say is that, you know, we can hold two things together at once, you know, as the great feminist ancestor Audre Lorde said in The Master's Tools. You know, we have to have what's called both and thinking. We have to be able to hold concepts that might be in tension together at the same time and show that, like, we can think about class, we can think about race, we can think about gender, we can think about gender on many axes, we can think about, like, the positions of trans people, the positions of gay people, and the positions of women at the same time. Those things are not in contest. They actually clarify things about each other's situations. And if we come into an understanding of how all of our oppressions are interlinked, we can actually help each other and form coalitions. Because if you think about all of the people who are marginalized in some way, it actually becomes the overwhelming majority of people. But if we buy into this version of identity politics that continues to divide us based on increasingly small criteria of difference, then we'll become so atomized and we'll become caught up in these competitions about who is the most oppressed, who has it worst, who is undermining who's, you know, like, seeing that, like, if trans people get ahead, that means women are behind, and if cis gay men get ahead, then trans people are behind. And it's like, you know, yes, people do undercut each other, people do compete because we live in a capitalist world where we're encouraged to compete, but that's not the failing of those groups, that's the failing of the system. I think in Sophie from Mars's latest video, she was saying, you know, the most important thing we can do as leftists is to cultivate systemic thinking. And one of the ways to do that is, again, to resist competition and to resist seeing each other individually as being in each other's way, and instead to understand that, you know, we're all in this together, and understanding our differences helps us to see that rather than separating us. Because again, it's that both and thinking, is that holding those two contradictory ideas at the same time. So anyway, thank you so much for listening to this rant. I hope you enjoyed this little sketchbook flip through and my brief thoughts. I hope you have a really nice day.